Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and a very warm welcome to the third session of the webinar series, Dissecting Capitalism, its Past, Present, and Future. This session is aptly titled Compressed Capitalism and Late Development in India. In July 1991, India officially embarked on a set of economic reforms that would eventually unleash massive capitalist development potential and the beginning of a new India. However, a common exclusion in this narrative is the rural landscape, where some places are yet to be impacted by these changes. To account for this phenomenon, we have an extremely talented professor who argues that an alternative approach is needed to understand India's development by placing it in the wider capitalist dynamic of the late 20th century. I will now call upon Satvik to introduce the wonderful speaker for today's session. Over to you, Satvik.
Thank you. Anthony P. Costa is an eminent scholar of global studies and professor of economics at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. In the last 30 years or so, he has taught at University of Melbourne as chair and professor of contemporary Indian studies at the Copenhagen Business School as an AP Moller-Maersk professor of Indian studies and National University of Singapore and the University of Washington as a professor of contemporary international development. A very poor summary would be he has written extensively on political economy. He is also recipient of numerous awards and fellowship. Personally, I know him because of his contribution to the land issues in India. The lecture will be based on his book, Changing Context and Shifting Roles of Indian State, and his research article, Capitalist Progress and Moral Economy. Welcome, Professor. Thank you for your time. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this very generous introduction, and I hope I can live up to your expectations. So I will do my best, even though it is early in the morning, but I think I am quite awake and I should be ready to roll. All right, so I'm going to begin with a sharing of my screen. And so the PowerPoint presentations then will be available to you. All right, so let me just see here. Oops, just a little patient. All right, so I'm just going to see what's happening here. All right, and go back to Zoom. Let's see, share screen. And can you see the screen? The PowerPoint screen? Yes, okay. All right, so let me just reduce this here. All right, so as you all know that I'm going to be presenting a topic called Compressed Capitalism and Late Development in India. This is a kind of a theoretical and a very macro level talk. And this is something that I've been thinking for a number of years. I wouldn't say that it's complete in my own understanding. So I'm still working on it as I work on other things, but hopefully, I will write something more sort of elaborate on this topic of compressed capitalism, perhaps when I'm retired. So I don't know. Let's see about that. Let's then look at what the presentation is about. So I'm going to offer an alternative structuralist understanding of contemporary capitalist trajectory. So in some sense, that what I'm trying to do in a very big way is to provide an understanding of how economies in the global south, but especially India, because that's what I'm familiar with, and India, of course, can be considered to be part of the global south, although with some variation and differences, is diverging from the advanced capitalist countries. So in one sense, we are sort of taking the view that early industrializers or early capitalist countries had a certain trajectory, and the so-called developing countries or post-colonial societies, or for that matter, what the term that I use, late industrializers, they are not following the same path. So that's basically what I'm trying to do here. And the explanation is that I introduce two notions of the nature of capitalism. One is that it is a very compressed form of capitalism, and the very fact that these entrants, that is the countries of the global south, are entering the capitalist game at a later in time. But all of this is set in a global sort of setting, in the sense that we cannot really talk about India independently of the global economy. And basically, I want to show how there is a compression and how there is a simultaneity or the coexistence of processes that generates uneven and combined development. Now, many of you may be familiar with this terminology, the uneven and combined development, which is really a, originally a Trotskyist idea. But really what it is trying to show is that how in the same sort of place or area or country, if you want to put it that way, or region, you can have both certain kinds of advancements, but also regressive forms of development. So the two things go together simultaneously. And this is basically what I'm trying to do in this paper. So there are really three big parts to this presentation. I provide a little bit of conceptual and methodological notes, talk about compression and lateness in India, and then of course I give you some examples which are, I think, readily understood when talking about India, especially in the case of India. So what are these conceptual and methodological notes? One, of course, is compressed capitalism. The other is lateness. And the approach is basically macro-historical, political economy of development. I look at world economy, or I take the world economy as one unit of analysis. So it's not really a country case in that sense, although one could interpret it that way, but really to situate India in the larger sort of global context, which is really a Wallersteinian, Brodelian kind of an approach regarding how you look at the world, how you try to explain social phenomenon. And India is, of course, many of those components that is part of this global system, even if it displays some autonomy in its economic processes. And overall, of course, it is a structuralist approach. I do understand that structuralism is out of fashion these days, but obviously I come from a generation that has been influenced by structuralism, and I still think that structuralist explanations do obviously go a long way in explaining the structure of the world and in the way it works. So there are really big pieces, and there is less room for what I would call agency, which means that in some ways it's a very sobering sort of statement to make, that there's not much you can actually do. What is compressed capitalism? Okay, first we need to understand capitalism, and I don't need to really go into the details of it. We know it's a market-based system driven by profit, and you basically are extracting economic surplus. And of course, economic surplus is that extra that you create beyond your subsistence, but through the use of wage labor, and which is of course regulated by the state. So this is a very loose, no doubt, but it is the definition of what we mean by capitalism. Now, what is the source of compressing this capitalism? First of all, the diffusion of capitalism. And of course, this is where the bigger question of where did capitalism arise, the origin of capitalism. I mean, I'm not going to get into that. Obviously, there has been a very interesting debate, the Brenner thesis or the Wallersteinian Brenner sort of, debate. And also you have, various other sort of Marxists have really tackle this question about the origins of capitalism. That do not need to detain us, because what we are interested in is the contemporary ways by which this capitalism is unfolding, and which is, of course, in a very uneven and combined sort of way. The main thing is, of course, the diffusion of capitalism is very uneven to begin with. So in other words, if you take a point in time, let's say today, you'll find that the way capitalism operates around the world is very uneven. Their starting points are very, very different if they were to start a race today. Countries and societies with different starting points, various degrees of lateness. Now, and that's another very interesting thing. In fact, the degrees of lateness, how early are you in the game, or how late are you in the game, right? There in itself, it makes a big difference in terms of this uneven sort of spread or diffusion of capitalism, right? And of course, you also have subsequent response to the colonial pattern of trade, which is the kind of way by which capitalism spread in the so-called former colonies, but then it had certain impact. And then, of course, subsequently, the states on independence, they obviously responded to this kind of, if you will, relationship with the world economy. And so then there was this so-called state-led industrialization, which was an attempt to compress capitalism. In other words, engineer the economic development quickly. And that, of course, is a form of compression, because in the early industrializers, the process was much more sort of, if you will, organic, in the sense that it grew rather slowly, but consistently and in a sort of long-term sort of way. Whereas in the late industrializers, the states are very active and they try to promote capitalism on a much faster sort of pace. And there's also the simultaneity of capitalist structural processes compared to the early developers. So developing countries in that sense, or late industrializers, they can't follow a neat and clean kind of sequence of processes. It just sort of is a kind of a mishmash of everything. And although they may be quite organic in some ways, but nevertheless, they are not, neatly sort of organized and sequenced, the process of development itself. So as a result of which, of course, you have this uneven development, but there is a combined element. And of course, I don't want to spend too much time on this. I have recently written a paper which should come out sometime next year, where it sort of shows that if you have uneven development, then of course, that in itself leads to a combined development because of the presence of early developers. So in other words, this impact that the late entrants face today is precisely because they were early industrializers. Or to put it in the contemporary context, just imagine China's presence limits the manufacturing options of the global South and even India. So China has sort of somehow made its presence felt, which then limits what others can do. In terms of lateness, of course, you can see that it's late to industrial capitalism, it's late to material transformation of society, and essentially it is trying to be like the West or the early entrants. This is what lateness is all about. So you may be familiar with Alexander Gerschenkron's work about the escape from economic backwardness. In some ways, of course, Gerschenkron is also following Trotsky, because backward countries supposedly have the advantage in the sense they can leapfrog. But again, the question is, how much can they leapfrog? But what the theme here, of course, is that they are trying to catch up to the West, right? So that sort of is the motor force behind late industrialization, is to catch up to the West or to raise the standards of living, mimicking the West, who were the early sort of entrants. Historically, of course, there's been various degrees of lateness, and you can see the list of countries there. Each one, and of course, this is not a very robust exercise here, but very roughly, you can see that there were certain kinds of early entrants, late entrants, late entrants, and so on and so forth. There is a temporal and spatial and institutional dimensions of lateness. It's the timing of late entry, fast. You enter quickly, rapid catch up by some countries and sectors, but also you have lagging countries and sectors. So this is a kind of a temporal as well as a spatial element. Of course, the quality of entry varies. It all depends on, when do you start, and then what kind of states and institutions you have. And those are the sort of determining factors, if you will, about lateness. But in the end, lateness provides, I would say, that both, yes, there are opportunities because you can leapfrog, but also there is a lot of institutional drag, I would say, which means that there are certain institutions that pull you down, not only because the institutions don't change, but they essentially morph into something in the contemporary context. So in other words, it's not just feudalism continuing today, but rather feudalism itself undergoes some change, and it fuses with capitalism in a way that sort of is something quite unusual. But in the overall effect of that fusion, of course, is that it acts as a kind of a drag on the rest of the economy or the society, or in terms of transformation itself. So very quickly, then you can see this is the origins of economic development, and you can see how the early industrializers, which is essentially the, you can more or less, you can assume that this is where everybody started off, and then you begin to see a big divergence. So there's a turning point for a few countries, which is, of course, typically the industrialized West. Of course, we could include Japan, but Japan is also considered to be a late industrializer, but pretty much caught up with the West, and it is included as part of the West. Then you had another set of late industrializers, which was East Asia. They also quickly grew, and they also caught up to some great extent. And then, of course, you have China. This is the rest of the world. Now, where India might be between China and the rest of the world in some context, but it's really with the rest of the world, as we will shortly see. So there was a turning point, and that's when, of course, the economic and the political systems begin to shift from a more conventional form of feudal setting to more of a capitalist, market-driven, sort of commercial, profit-driven kind of a system. So this turning point, the question, of course, is where does the global South fit in, and where does India fit in terms of this turning point? And clearly, of course, do we know if there is a turning point in India or not? I mean, that may not be something that I can settle today conclusively. There is obviously some turning points here and there, but then on others, perhaps there isn't any turning point. And same thing here, again, very quickly, just to sort of give you the sense that, path dependence, and that's what we are really talking about. So what happens, in B is influenced by A, and of course, there are certain variables operating on B, Y, and X, and then C is a result of B and A. Of course, we don't know how much influence A has on C at this point in time. And for that matter, how much of influence does B have at this point in time in D? But we do know that the past influences the present. And this is something to keep in mind, because when you're talking about long-term economic change or economic shifts, clearly, of course, the past does have an impact. It's just that we cannot relate precisely as to how much of that impact can be felt from the past, but we need to keep that in mind. And also there is intervention. This is perhaps where that element of agency comes in, whereby you intervene and you can alter the course of the path. So for example, if you intervene, then maybe this is where the path is, but without that intervention, it could have been this, or without that intervention also, it could have been that. We don't know. It's only on hindsight that we can often understand some of these things. But there is a thing known as path dependence for late development, which then, of course, provides you with some different scenarios about what was actually possible and what actually happened. All right. So here's a very quick example of fast entry, rapid catch up in a global setting. And this is, of course, Goldman Sachs' new Bangalore campus, which was opened in 2019. Who would think that this is India? Nobody, if you look at it without all those captions, all right? And this, yes, probably everybody would know that this is India. This is in Dharavi slum. You can see informal workers, unorganized workers, obviously sewing something, stitching something, and obviously they're part of the formal market. So in other words, they may be unorganized and informal, but they're actually part of a formal market. So that's what I'm trying to get at, is this coexistence of both catch-up and lagging sectors, if you will. So let's look at compression and lateness in India. As a framework then, what I've tried to do, and this of course has undergone many, many revisions in terms of trying to figure out exactly how I want to set up this framework. But basically, we have a thing known as primitive accumulation. This, as you know, Marx wrote about saying that this is really what comes first in the sort of, the capitalist sort of revolution, where you had to generate the original capital. And the way this original capital is generated, of course, it is a very violent process. Essentially, it is the dispossession sort of element to it. Dispossession of the peasants. And obviously, dispossession of the peasants means that land is taken over and land is then put to certain kind of commercial use as opposed to subsistence. This is where the major change comes from regarding capital accumulation, is that initially you have to have primitive accumulation, and land is a source of that primitive accumulation, whereby there is displacement and dispossession. So for developing countries, then it becomes the agrarian question. From an economic development point of view, this is also a very crucial question, because once you can get the quote unquote surplus labor from the countryside, then obviously you have the process of economic growth sort of set into motion, that agriculture will become very, very productive. Obviously, people will not be needed. People will leave the countryside. And as incomes increase in the agricultural sector, they become the source of demand for industrial output. And of course, industries will expand on the basis of the surplus labor that shows up from the countryside to the cities and towns. That's supposed to be the process, okay, in terms of this sort of shift away from land to industry or from agriculture to industry. But there is this thing called primitive accumulation. And primitive accumulation is as I said, can be a very, very violent process. Historically, it has been a very violent process. The question, of course, is what is the status of primitive accumulation in India, or what is the status of the agrarian question in India? So that's one thing. And then you have state capitalism, whereby independent states, of course, then they tried to catch up. They tried to catch up through certain sort of policies, gradual sort of approach to catching up, but at the same time, they're intervening a lot. And at the same time, they are also incubating the capitalists. Now, this, of course, is, I'm talking in this part, is the advanced capitalist countries, all right? So state capitalism, gradual growth, and you have the maturity of capitalists. So in other words, the capitalist class becomes over time mature, and the state has been supporting them all this while in one form or another. And then you have the sort of formation of what we call formal markets and the disappearance of petty commodity production with scale economies. In other words, production becomes very large scale. Whatever petty commodity production that existed gradually begins to disappear, and formal markets take over with large scales of output. So this, of course, is the classical, what I would call the classical capitalist progression. I know I'm reducing a lot of details here, but just for the analytical purpose, this is what I need to do in order to sort of show how then late capitalism is different from this. Now, the difference, of course, is that while in the rich countries or in the advanced capitalist countries, the process of primitive accumulation is virtually over. There is no question of agrarian question as such in these places. On the other hand, in the developing world, there is this primitive accumulation. And of course, state capitalism is playing a role, promoting capitalists in these countries. There is some elements of leapfrogging and catch up going on. But the problem, of course, is that state in itself is not a very fully formed institution in the way we think that it should be supporting capitalism or could support capitalist development. The state has been captured. That's, I think, one of the legacies, if you will, of late capitalism. Not in every country in the same way, but certainly in India, it is the case. It is a captured state, it is a fragmented state, and therefore, even sort of setting a direction of economic development becomes very, very problematic. So this is a problem of lateness. In other words, how states are formed in a late situation. Now, in some countries like, let's say, South Korea, or for that matter, Singapore, the states have been very well formed, and obviously they function very, very well, at least when it comes to economic development. But the Indian state is a slightly different case. And then the other, I think, very important distinction between classical capitalist progression and late capitalism is that in late capitalist systems, you have the persistence of petty commodity production. They're tiny operations and a lot of self-employment, which is really a coping mechanism. And basically what this sector represents is the inability of the formal sector, which of course is very strong in the early capitalist countries, the formal sector to absorb this so-called more people or more labor in this formal sector. And this is, of course, mainly because these are countries that are starting very late, and they have ongoing sort of primitive accumulation with, of course, surplus labor still in the countryside. In other words, this process of labor moving from the countryside to the cities is not complete, and in fact, nowhere near complete. And the result of all of this then is uneven and development, or dualism, if you will, or enclave type of development, which means that you have pockets of excellence and then vast pools of inefficiency, small scale production, and basically people struggling to make a living. So the primitive accumulation origin, of course, is, I don't need to go any further than this. This is, of course, yes, the book that we put together, Achin Chakraborty and myself, and we organized a conference with a number of participants. And there are some interesting papers in the volume. And there we tried to tackle the question of the agrarian question. And of course, we basically found that, the agrarian question is almost a no question at all in the Indian case, in the way the Indian countryside is evolving. And this is one of the interesting things. In other words, what we find, of course, is that there has not been that much of expelling of surplus labor. As you know, as I mentioned before, that labor has to move out of the countryside if you want to get the agricultural sector to be productive and dynamic, which would then, of course, be complementary to the industrial sector. The problem, of course, is that there is still a lot of surplus labor. In fact, there has not been what we call a Lewisian turn. Arthur Lewis, of course, is the one who talked about, in a more abstract sort of way, that in the end you have to move people out, the surplus labor, and then of course you can get the economy going. But obviously that has not happened because, as we will see, about 50% of India's workforce is still engaged in the agricultural sector. That, of course, is a very, very high number, as we will see. But the interesting thing, of course, historically, Europe sent out surplus labor to North America, South Africa, Australia, and so on, roughly about 30 million people. And of course, the number of people that left relative to the total population was very high, because these were small countries, small societies. So this fact, of course, often gets lost in the discussion about primitive accumulation and the agrarian question in the global South. Okay, now I'll say a few more things about that in a few minutes, but let's look at the changing structure of the Indian economy. Most of you will be familiar with this. The main thing to consider, of course, is that this is the relative share of the different sectors to GDP. And of course, the red line is the one that shows the relative share of agriculture. Now, if other things, constant, of course, this line would tell us that, well, India is actually doing the right thing because the economy is diversifying. Diversifying because the relative value of agriculture to GDP is falling. Okay. And this is the service sector, the black line. This one is the services sector. And so, of course, India has kind of taken the services turn, as we will see. And the green one is the manufacturing. Now, in economic development, of course, we expect from agriculture to move to industry, and the services being a residual thing, obviously services, right? So services is a third thing, and whatever is left over, that's what all services are. But the troubling feature, of course, is that although it did take off earlier in the 50s, then it begins to slow down, and of course it plateaus. So manufacturing in India seems to be rather sort of weak or stagnating. But at the same time, within services, you can have this so-called finance, insurance, real estate, and business services. These are typically higher value services, not your typical low-end services. So this segment of the services sector seems to be actually doing quite well and taking off, as you can see by this dotted sort of line. Now, the question, of course, is that, given this scenario, it's quite clear that, okay, India is more or less, when it comes to agriculture, India is following a very typical path. But when you look at manufacturing, India is not following a typical path, because the services sector has considerably taken over the economy in terms of its contribution to GDP. If I had the graph of China, which I do have, but I will not be showing it to you, it would look quite different. In fact, the agriculture part, China will pretty much look the same or similar. In fact, it has fallen even more sharply. But what will be different, of course, is their manufacturing or their industrial sector. So the question, of course, is, has there been a Lewisian turn? And as we will see, that probably not. There was one paper regarding China which claimed that, yes, maybe China has seen a Lewisian turn. But again, I think the verdict on that is also needs to be weighted upon, only because China too has a very large proportion of its workforce in the agricultural sector. So this is more recent data. And again, pretty much the same thing is being reflected. In fact, you can actually see that the industrial sector is relatively becoming less, while at the same time, what you can see is that the high value services, which is the black line, is actually the same. Its contribution to GDP is almost the same as the agricultural sector. But here lies the paradox. The paradox being that when you look at employment, then you find that, of course, agriculture is a vast employer of the Indian sort of workforce. And this is, of course, the agricultural employment which you see over here. So naturally, we can very easily deduce, and we know it for a fact, that Indian agriculture is, because of so many people dependent on agriculture, India's agricultural productivity is very low, internationally very, very low, much lower than China's. And clearly, of course, there is something going on in the countryside that does not seem to be altering the agricultural situation in India itself. So to come to the primitive accumulation again, then it's quite clear that it's very different. First of all, as we mentioned in the West European case, where they were able to let people go, in other words, there was a lot of emigration. Lateness obviously means that no opportunity to expel surplus labor today. In other words, India, or for that matter, other countries do not have that opportunity to send millions of people outside the country. That opportunity does not exist. So obviously, it's going to create some issues there. Clearly, of course, imperialism or colonialism did have an impact in the countryside. But one of the things, of course, it did do is that in many cases, it reinforced certain types of archaic institutions, such as money lending and so on, which still persists in rural India. There is, of course, little tax from agriculture, as we know, and we'll talk about political society using Partha Chatterjee's sort of terminology. But also it suggests perhaps that the state in itself is captured if no agriculture income tax is being paid, when we know that there are also rich landowners as well, or rich farmers. There's a question of land distribution and change, which is, of course, no longer on the political agenda. There was a time when land reforms was on the agenda, but obviously today nobody really talks about it. Land holdings are getting smaller. And of course, we can see that the state is encouraging primitive accumulation through state-mandated rent-seeking activities in business, leading to graft, kickbacks, capital flight, and so on. So in other words, there's a lot of things that are basically going in a way that is very, very counterproductive to, let's say, economic development. And at the same time, you have the rise of the informal sector. This is something, again, we are very, very familiar with. And as a result of which, what we see is that increasingly, both the income as well as the wealth gap has been rising very, very sharply in the case of India as well. And this, of course, again, is a reflection of this uneven development, the encroachment on land, gradually as urbanization, real estate take off. Although at the moment, of course, we do know that the Indian economy has slowed down considerably. There are some signs that maybe it will start, going back to its pre-pandemic levels, but it's not something that I want to dwell on because it's much too recent. I want to talk about the general trajectory of Indian development. So let's look at the nature of compression, if you will. First of all, of course, there's a fragmented state. And again, I don't need to talk about this. All of you are familiar with this. What are the sources of state fragmentation? There is intra-elite, elite civil society conflicts. There is state-led industrialization, no doubt, but lateness also imposes a desire for redistribution. Now, this is a very peculiar kind of a problem in the sense that because we live in an enlightened era, so we expect that all citizens should have certain basic rights. And what that means, of course, is that the state is obviously responsible for its citizens and therefore must also look after its citizens. But the problem, of course, is that without actually having a whole lot of resources, the state also must meet these social obligations. Now, I am not being an apologist here that somehow the state shouldn't be doing this. No, what I'm trying to say here is the early industrializers did not have this issue. In other words, they were not paying attention to the welfare sort of aspects of it. They obviously moved on as the way the economies were being reorganized, expanded through capitalist sort of industrial development. Late industrializers, on the other hand, have this additional responsibility. In fact, one can now even be asking the question, given that Glasgow conference is just about to be over, or it's already over, that developing countries must also spend resources to have a better environment, which of course is a necessary thing, but at the same time, it is imposing a certain type of cost, and it is the lateness itself that which imposes this cost, because they haven't quite economically developed as well. But this is, again, it's a distraction at the moment, but the point is the same, that when you start late, then you have additional responsibilities. And obviously there is an overextended state, and it doesn't have the capacity, mainly because it is a fragmented state. So these are some of the problems of what the state is, even though it is trying to basically catch up and incubate capitalists in this catch-up process, trying to mimic the trajectory of the early industrializers. It's different for India. And of course, I don't need to go into all of these points, which you can basically see. The main thing, of course, is that today land has become economically unattractive, but people hold on to land as non-agricultural alternatives are dismal. This, of course, is a huge problem. In fact, that also tells us that there is no Lewisian turn. The agrarian question or the agrarian transition has not been resolved in India. There is rural-urban distress migration. In other words, it's not that people are not migrating. They are under duress. They are migrating, but also it has become seasonal, which means that they go to the cities, work, if there is work available, and then they return. But of course, with the pandemic, things have become even worse in the sense that they're probably permanently going back to the countryside. So this kind of reverse migration is also something very unusual, at least from a historical point of view, that large numbers of people will be going back to agriculture, even though we know that the agricultural sector is not very productive and people are basically struggling to make a living in the agricultural sector. The handloom sector is interesting, although I know that perhaps I was going to speak a lot about it, but actually I just want to say that the handloom sector is neither here nor there. It's a sector that is of the past, but it is trying to exist in the present. And of course, it is part of the capitalist market, which may not have been the case in the past. And so it's really struggling. And of course, that's where the state needs to provide some help. But the solution, we don't know yet. In fact, my paper is also very sort of tentatively concludes that only if the state does this and that, perhaps it could. But at the moment, the verdict is still out. It may not survive in a robust sort of way. There's also this notion of the petty commodity producers, but also within that, you have what is the floating population, what Kalyan Sanyal talks about dark spaces, who are outside the orbit of capital. So they are kind of reserve army of labor, if you will. And they're all part of the informal, unorganized sector. Now, this is again something that one would think that with all this growth that has taken place in India, that somehow these would slowly begin to sort of disappear. But there is no sign of that. In fact, it is persistent, very large, and millions and millions of people are part of this sector. And interestingly enough, in fact, more and more people seem to be joining it because of the other kinds of changes that are taking place in the economy. Now, as I mentioned, that because we live in enlightened times, and this is where, of course, Partha Chatterjee talks about political society, which means that these people who get left out, who are outside of the orbit of capital, who are not engaged in any kind of meaningful, productive kind of opportunities, then obviously they have to be looked after, they have to be given certain type of support, because then it becomes a governing problem. In other words, you could have political problems. So in other words, what the state is doing, and what Partha Chatterjee also says, is that they're deferring this primitive accumulation process. In other words, the results of primitive accumulation would be that there would be a lot of people who would be, dispossessed. And because there are no real jobs or meaningful jobs in the urban areas for a lot of these people, then the question is, how do you then maintain a political system without too much of instability. So it's a form of income transfers, if you will, low levels of income, but it is also a form of compression, because what you're doing is you're deferring the primitive accumulation process. And then, of course, there are many other aspects to this compression. You have poor education and health. You have lots of wealthy businesses today. There's a tremendous amount of capital flight. And of course, you have pronounced inequality, which of course then acts as a kind of a demand constraint on the economy as well, with so much inequality in the country. And as I've said that, the finance, insurance, real estate, and business services, these are all high value export driven services, and they are skill biased. So which means that they don't necessarily absorb a whole lot of people, given the size of the workforce. But the interesting thing is that their contribution to GDP is very similar to agriculture, with a far larger share of people working in agriculture. You also have a kind of industrialization, which again is part of the problem of lateness. And that is, you have capital intensive industrialization, and therefore oftentimes you witness this phenomenon of jobless growth, which is also partly due to automation and mechanization. So what Danny Roderick calls premature deindustrialization, it's similar in what he's describing, although he's focused more on globalization and labor saving sort of technologies at low income levels. I am talking about premature deindustrialization in a slightly different way, in the sense that there are many other things that are going on, and especially with this incomplete primitive accumulation that also leads to other kinds of problems where industrialization does not take off, but also because of the presence of China and other sort of fast moving countries that have industrialized very, very rapidly on a very, very large scale. So this, of course, is the compression as well as lateness in sort of inaction and the kind of results that it produces in India. So we have competition. In fact, even our neighboring country, Bangladesh, is become a very important competitor to Indian sort of textiles. And of course, as you know, India has a very strong tradition of textiles, a very large sector, and yet Bangladesh seems to have caught the world's attention when it comes to the textile and garments industry. So in other words, India is faced with considerable amount of competition. So in other words, what else is going on in India that does not even allow it to do a very sort of, to be smart about competing with countries that basically have the similar kinds of labor endowments? This, I think, is the issue. The other is entering the world markets, which is, again, you may not be able to see this very well, but I've sort of highlighted something. This is the global value chains for leather products. And these red portions are the low-end part of the leather processing. They're done in rural, urban India, let's say, developing countries, because of the hides and the skin, and then they use chemical processes to cure them, which is, of course, the most polluting stage. And then it's the rich countries or the rich markets that obviously have the retail chains, the agents, the brands, the marketing. And of course, that's where they capture most of the value. So entering the global market also for late industrializers become very, very difficult in the way the world is structured in terms of global value chains. China, of course, as I mentioned, is the world's manufacturing superpower. I mean, China's share is 28.7% of global manufacturing output in 2019. Compare that to India's 3.1%. Now, clearly, of course, there is a huge gap, and of course, the widening gap, in other words, in terms of what a late industrializer like India can do, whereas China did. Now, of course, China is a late industrializer, and how it went about doing what it did is a different story. But we can obviously think about China at the same time. It obviously did things differently compared to, let's say, what India has done so far, or India has been able to do so far. Here's again, sort of visually trying to sort of show the future of work. Foxconn, as you know, is a Taiwanese company that manufactures the Apple iPhone in China. And China has lots of workers to do manufacturing, although there are certain shortages appearing. But even Foxconn that manufactures in China is thinking of replacing people with machines. And this is a company, of course, it's a robots manufacturing company in India, which is for warehousing. Now, you would think that warehousing is a labor-intensive activity where people will essentially, there are so many people looking for work who could be lifting boxes and moving them from shelf to shelf and transporting them at least on some kind of mechanized trolleys or something. So the thing is that, yeah, clearly you can see that, but yet India is also a manufacturer of robots, where you would think that, robots and labor abundant India does not go quite together. But as I said, late industrialization also means that businesses have to keep up with the changes in technology, the changes in competitiveness, and India is also compelled, structurally compelled, to also undertake those kinds of production that might be actually ill-suited to the kind of resource endowments that the country has. But it is a structural imperative, I would say. In other words, businesses in India don't necessarily make those types of choices where they will say, well, they will hire more workers. If it pays them to hire more workers, they will. But if it pays them not to hire workers and use machines, they will then use machines. So the persistence of the informal sector, again, this is a very familiar story. It's really persistent because it doesn't seem to change. So the unorganized, if you look at the numbers, the share or the percentages simply do not change. So if you look at the total between, let's say, these 2 years, you can see 91.9 and 92.7. Okay, not much of a difference. I suspect that with the more sort of recent data, it will probably look again very much the same, if not even worse. But what is interesting, of course, is that one would think that with capitalist development, PCP is expected to disappear, but petty commodity production does not seem to be going away. Here's the other aspect of compression. So India, despite all the problems of primitive accumulation, surplus labor, and so on, you also have a very, very wealthy class. And I mean very wealthy class, because we are talking about billionaires in India. So the number of billionaires has been going up, as you can clearly see. Although this may not be so unusual given the size of India's economy, but nevertheless, I think it sort of places a very sort of stark contrast to the kind of impoverishment that you also see in India. And the wealthy are getting obviously wealthier. So this is taken from Piketty and Chancel, the World Inequality Report, which is available on the web. You can see that in terms of the wealthy getting wealthier, if you look at the top 0.001% of India's wealthy, then they have grown by 2,726%, right? So in other words, in fact, they have grown the fastest compared to the same group in China, France, or the US. And if you look at certainly between China and India, if you look at the bottom 50%, which is really, we're talking about the less fortunate people, then you can see that they have grown the least in India compared to, say, China's 312%. But overall, what it shows, of course, is that India's wealthy, there are very, very wealthy people and wealthy businesses, and the wealthy are getting even wealthier. And this is, of course, the sort of income inequality taken from the same source, from the World Inequality Report. But here, I think it's interesting because I want to bring up this Kuznets curve, because Kuznets, as you know, talked about the relationship between growth and inequality. So the argument was that, basically with growth, initially the inequality will increase, but over time, the inequality will reduce. Now, what we have, and of course, this may be a kind of a cynical remark at this point, that, India is going through this huge sort of divergence in wealth and income. In other words, inequality is becoming very, very pronounced. So the question, of course, is that if you were to believe in the Kuznets curve, does this mean that better days are ahead? This, I think, is what I want to sort of say. And obviously, we have no way of knowing this, but certainly given the structural conditions, I don't think that good days are ahead or the Achhe Din are ahead. Okay. So let me then conclude here. I know I've taken a little bit more time than I should have. The agrarian question is not resolved. The peasantry is not being dissolved in the classical way. The Petty commodity production continues to persist in a very, very big way in the Indian system. The political society is a necessity, not necessity, but rather the resources devoted to the political society has become necessary, but it is unproductive, and it really does not lead to any kind of transformation that we would like to see. State-led industrialization, of course, leads to compression and leapfrogging, but the transformation remains incomplete. And even though Indian capitalists are mature and then they compete at a global sort of basis, but they are subject to the same forces of using modern technology, reducing costs, and basically what it shows is that capital is also not national because they operate at a global level. In fact, capital flight from India is actually a very, very common sort of problem, even though detecting it sometimes may be difficult. Premature deindustrialization. India, of course, faced deindustrialization during the colonial period, but of course, we are talking about a form of deindustrialization today, which, as you can see that at very low levels of income, India is not really able to industrialize further. Even though in certain areas, it has been able to leapfrog into such, let's say, such things as high value services in the IT and business services, but the spread of decent work is also limited. And participation in global value chains is also limited, mainly because of China's and other countries' earlier sort of entry. And in some ways, late entry widens the technology gap. This, of course, is something that is almost the reverse of the ability to leapfrog. So on the one hand, late entry supposedly allows leapfrogging, which it does. In some cases it does, certain sectors it does, but it also widens the technology gap in many other areas. So in other words, catching up then becomes almost impossible. Economic dualism with a small, modern, dynamic sector, but you basically have enclave economies. So in the end, what we have in India is a very different kind of capitalism. And lateness is both of the past. So obviously there's some legacy issues, but also what it looks like, we are already seeing it today. In other words, the future is already with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much. Now Anisha will take over the Q&A session. I have some questions. Okay, somebody has already written some question. Mohammed Waqif, would you like to ask the question by yourself, or you want me to read it out? It's always better.
Let's see. You can ask the question, yeah, by yourself. That will save us some time, maybe.
Yeah. No, Mohammed Waqif. No. Okay. So I will do that. Then no, Anisha, would you like to please? It's your turn.
No, it's fine, Satvik. You can go ahead. Okay.
No,
anyway,
please.
Okay. All right, Professor. So the question by Mohammed has been, it's in 2 stages. Number 1, where you would locate emerging Indian startups with globally competitive technology innovations in the framework of late capitalist compression. Also, do you see the potential of startup economy fueled by ease of doing business in contributing to higher growth rates in India? And the second part of the question is there a correlation between compressed capitalist economy to that of the nature of political economy, which he says is democratic versus autocratic?
Okay, all right. Let me then take these 2 first. Okay, the startups in some ways is a very good example of this so-called compression. Compression because startups are they are basically those types of firms that rely on certain types of technologies. They rely on a certain type of financing. Obviously, there's a certain entrepreneurial energy that is associated with these. And then they operate in a very sort of different sort of market segment. So in some ways, then startups is a form of what might say leapfrogging. Okay, it's a form of leapfrogging. I mean, if you take a startup, where do the startups take place? You don't see startups taking place in the countryside. You don't see startups in, now, yes, there might be some agricultural sort of, modern agricultural types of companies that are trying to streamline, let's say, their supply logistics, so you may see some of that. But still, those are, very small part of the overall agrarian economy that we know of exists in India. So startups in many ways is basically this leapfrogging sort of dimension, if you will, in the scheme that I've been talking about, all right? The ease of doing business, yes, obviously we want to make it easier for businesses to do business, but ease of doing business is, in some ways it's an institutional issue, and probably it could be tied into the late entry, if you will, aspects of compressed capitalism. Because why are they? What are those institutions that impede doing business? I guess that's the question. What are those institutions, and where do these things come from? So obviously there are different political interests that we have in the country. They are not speaking with one voice. They don't have a direction. So it is what we call a fragmented state. Nobody is really in charge. It is more to do with who has influence and power and the ability to capture the state. So even if, and of course, I'm sure you're aware that there was this huge problem with the World Bank's ease of doing business also, but that's not the issue here. The ease of doing business, yes, I think if you were to make it easier for doing business, but the question, of course, is where are the bottlenecks and why do these bottlenecks exist? I think that's where the question is. And I suspect that some of these bottlenecks are precisely because of the kind of institutions that India has inherited. So in other words, there are different types of interests. Not all businesses think alike. Not all businesses are alike, in the sense there are some small, there are some big, there are some export oriented, some are very domestic oriented, some prefer protection, others would like to compete. There's a whole range of possibilities around businesses. So ease of doing business may or may not, although I think at a low hanging fruit level, obviously, yes, ease of business will help in getting business going, all right? And when it comes to the nature of political economy, compressed capitalism is a form of political economy. All you're doing is you're situating it in a very large sort of global context to see how capitalism is unfolding in a late industrializer or late entrant to development, such as, say, India. It is political economy because there are issues of both growth and distribution. There are issues of both, capital as well as the state. So these are all political economic sort of dimensions to the discussion of late industrialization and late development.
Thank you, Professor.
I have some questions, so if nobody is going to ask, I'm going to use.
Yes, please, Satwik, go ahead.
Okay, I have 3 questions. First, where do you place caste in this compressed development? Second is, do you see a tendency among the developing economies in terms of race to the bottom, in terms of wages? So India had lower wages. Now Bangladesh has even competitively lower wages. So they are progressing in garment industry and also medical instrument and medicine. And the third one, can you share some something on how, if there was any informality in advanced economics during their development, capitalist advanced development, and how they have tried to deal with that, or by kicking people out of England, they have managed to deal with informality together. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Maybe I'll come back to the third question. I'll ask you some clarifications later on. Let me first address the first two. Yes, where do you place caste? Okay, caste is one of those things that nobody knows what to do with it. All right, it's it's obviously it's a very peculiar Indian institution, although there are some variations of caste in some other places, but not to the extent that it is in India. Clearly, of course, it is an institution that has come from the past. It has changed. I would say that it is not the same as it was before. It has changed, but obviously the way socially it operates, that's something that needs addressing in a very sort of big transformative way. And it's not going to be your economic growth that will address it, for sure. It obviously has to do with even education in the way it is done. I mean, educated people are also, fully aware of their caste status, and they use it to their advantage. So clearly, of course, education doesn't seem to be doing it. The only other thing that one can think of is that how to bring in caste in this analysis. Of course, I don't have, a creative way to bring caste into this analysis other than to simply put it into this institutional dimension. That is, that how caste is part of that institutional structure which India has inherited, which has undergone certain kind of change, but also there is a part of the caste dynamics that probably does not fit in very well with what I'm saying, because it's something that it is a social institution, but then of course when you look at caste politics in India, of course then it throws up a whole lot of other things. So in some ways, the only way I can sort of place it is to talk about inheriting institutions, which of course are also undergoing change, because the caste system is also undergoing change. The people, I guess the question here is, are we talking about caste as a form of identity, or are we talking about caste as the source of kind of discrimination? I think these are they are two related questions, no doubt, they're related issues. But clearly, of course, is the discrimination aspect, which is, of course, the troublesome one. Because there have been, certain kind of mobility even among the castes, not a huge, but there has been some mobility. India's, affirmative action in the education and government employment systems, they obviously have done some nudging, if not, transforming it, but they have obviously been helpful. And I think they still, I think the way this caste system, if it were to disappear, it will be, small bites, because in India, you cannot have, everything is sort of tends to move to the center. It's very hard to have anything that is highly sort of, disruptive, and nobody likes it, whether the politicians or the citizens, they generally don't like it. So obviously you have to nibble at the problem all the time, I think. And that's the only way that I think the fact. So yes, we can start at in the education system, in the employment section. And of course, the people themselves must sort of start internalizing the idea that caste is something that we need to get rid of. This is, of course, the problem. In fact, I just read this morning about inequality. There's a report on Indian inequality, but they look at this caste aspect. And this person, talks about caste and, almost ends in a kind of a hopeless note, because there's not much. It's a very long-term kind of a problem. Okay. The question about, race to the bottom. Yes, I think the race to the bottom is something that would be very much, part of, the capitalist sort of dynamic. That's for sure. In other words, and especially in a sector like garments, because the garments industry has moved from one place to another over time, many, many times. So if you think of, in the post World War II period, and because I'm in the US, the garments industry used to be in northeastern United States, and most of it was in the northeastern United States, and then over time, it started moving to the southern United States. So basically where I am, North Carolina, all of these places. And the reason was very simple: lower costs, lower wages, right? So it moved to the south. And then from the south, it moved to Asia. So it moved to, it moved to, well, Korea was there. You had even Japan was exporting textiles in the 60s. And then, of course, it spread to other Asian countries. It spread to, of course, India, even though India had a long-standing traditional textile sector, but then India got involved also with export, of textiles. Then, of course, it moved to Bangladesh. Then the US has a special program with the Caribbean countries, and so then in Caribbean as well, and so on and so forth. Vietnam today, for example. So the thing is that the textile industry is very labor intensive, and it is very sensitive to costs. And so, yes, it is one of those things that it will move. But it is also a sector where after some time, of course, it becomes almost a dead-end kind of industry. In other words, you have to diversify. If you don't diversify, then how much of, because exports is one of, the textiles is one of those things where virtually anybody can enter. There's no real barriers to entry. Now, of course, today the way textiles are manufactured is generally manufactured under contract, which means there'll be some major retail company which will make the orders, and then, of course, they will have the contract manufactured. Now, the third question, you talked about surplus people. I wasn't quite clear.
I was thinking that if there was informality when the industrial country, now advanced economy were industrializing, so how they dealt with their informality?
Well, see, the thing is, well, in fact, I had a statistics, but I couldn't pull it out. I don't know where I had it with me. But in the early sort of phase of US industrialization, there was a certain amount of what we call the informal sector. In fact, that is inevitable. When in the early stages of industrialization, because you're getting workers from the countryside, not everybody is going to find good work in the industry. So they have to make a living somehow, doing odd jobs. And that's basically what it is, right? But the thing is that because of the sustained period of growth that you had in the US and elsewhere, not very high growth, but sustained period of reasonably good rates of growth, which began to then absorb people into gainful employment. Basically, that was what was going on. And so then on top of that, of course, you had the sort of, if you will, the labor movements that made sure, of course, that some basic minimum was provided by the state, and they had the resources to do it. So with this political sort of pressure, the state also had to sort of make sure that you did not have people sleeping on the sidewalks or anything like that. You had to provide something for them. So this notion of welfare also begins to sort of kick into the picture. That's what they did. Now, in the case of India, the problem, of course, is that the surplus people, it's not that there isn't migration. In fact, people from the countryside are migrating to the cities. Problem is that they're not getting good enough jobs because there aren't good enough jobs. So they are also joining. So as it is, agriculture is unorganized or informal activity. Now those who leave, they're joining the urban informal activity. And the question is, what do you do with it? Well, merely formalizing it is not going to do anything, because formalization means they have to be registered. They have to be, some way tax paying. And as you know that, a lot of businesses, especially in the informal sector, those who are doing reasonably well, they don't want to pay any taxes. So they don't want to be registered. They'll remain informal. Of course, what I am talking about, the informal sector, is really these very small, single owner operated types of places. And on top of that, also, I am talking about people who do just odd jobs, not even on a daily basis, maybe, 2-3 times a week, they may get some few hours worth of work. So their existence is very, very precarious. All of these, most of these informal, there are some wealthy businesses within the informal sector, but vast majority are not. And they're basically living on a day-to-day basis kind of thing. So you can't do anything other than to ensure that they get some decent jobs. I guess that's the only thing. So in other words, it's employment that would actually solve a lot of these kinds of issues. But then the problem is that how do you create that employment given what is going on in the rest of the world and where India is placed in this world?
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. So next up we have Suresh. Suresh, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question? Try and be as concise as possible. Thank you.
Hello, sir. It's actually the extension of the last question that was asked by Satvik sir. So my point is, like, if you see, like, we are trying to formalize everything, but if you see the problem of informality within the formal sector. For example, if you take any institutes, you have what is called housekeeping staff, security guards, and etc. Even if you go to the IT sector, there you have a BPO, KPO, all these things. So how you see this problem of informality in the formal sector?
Okay. This phenomenon of informality within the formal sector is not peculiarly Indian. It is also taking place in many other places, including the United States, except that in the United States, even if you are sort of made to, the informality, the degree of informality in the US is very different, let's say, from in the case of India. Because in the US, you will still be governed by certain types of regulation. Whereas in India, there is no regulation regarding the informal sector. But the process is somewhat similar because of competitiveness, this race to the bottom, if you will, that businesses are basically finding ways to reduce their costs even more. So one of the things that, of course, they do is to make those employees that were originally or initially permanent, they become now temporary, or they become contract workers. Now in India, the contract workers is a very big phenomenon. In fact, it's nothing new actually. It has been going on for quite some time. When I was studying the automobile industry in the 1990s, there was contract workers in the automobile industry, right? So contract workers are always there, but it looks like the reliance on contract workers in India has increased substantially. So in other words, of course, the argument has been, excuse me, the argument has been that, well, there are all these regulations and we can't lay off workers or fire workers, and therefore we are getting around these rules. Of course, the interesting thing is that they were actually violating those rules because you couldn't lay off workers, but instead of laying off workers, you were simply making them temporary workers or contract workers. So this was one of the ways by which businesses were getting around the loophole, if you will, avoiding this particular sort of regulation. But businesses were essentially trying to reduce their costs by creating this so-called informal workers within the formal sector. Now, in the case of the IT industry, and of course, this is, I mean, the IT industry will basically say, well, we are doing what we actually practice. And that is, Indian IT companies are basically contract sort of service providers, if you will. So they're providing contract services to American clients, right? So therefore, the security guards and the domestic help that work for these individuals or the corporate or these IT companies, they are also doing the same thing where they're basically subcontracting them out in some ways. So in other words, this idea of not having permanent employees is a cost reducing mechanism, right? And you create obviously a certain kind of informality to reduce your costs. Even the government of India, if I'm not mistaken, the state enterprises have often actually created a whole cadre of contract workers within their system, which means that previously permanent employees have now become temporary or contract workers, which means that they are not subject to the rules or the salaries or whatever governed by the public sector, but instead they fall under some private company which basically does the recruiting and the farming of workers to the different clients. So I am not surprised in terms of the way, let's say, informalization has increased even within the formal sector. In fact, see, the thing is, you have to ask the question, what are the things you can do without actually doing it yourself. And there is no end to that, as you know. So obviously, certain things can be done because of the technologies. So you know, IT industry, certain things can be done because they can be done remotely. But certain other things, if you don't need to have your own workers, under your own payroll, you let somebody else do it, because it also, from a business point of view, it also gets rid of many of the headaches that is associated with your own employees. Let somebody else deal with those headaches. You pay them a lump sum or on a contract basis, and then they will take care of the people's salaries and so on. So it's a way of, you know, reducing what we call transaction costs. That's what we call. But that's a very business language thing. And of course, in a capitalist setting, reducing transaction costs has a certain human cost. If you think about it that way. Yeah.
Okay, Professor. I have a question pertaining to privatization. As we see recently, India is increasing the scale of privatization, with more state-owned enterprises being sold off so that they can fund the economy and various purposes. How exactly do you think that it would fit within the capitalistic dynamic in India? Because we have seen some successes of privatization, like, you know, the Japanese railway. But then we've also seen failures, like the Texas power grid, which actually failed last year, I believe. So
well,
how exactly?
You can take British railways as a failure also.
Yeah.
Privatization of the British rail system.
True.
Right.
So
no, I mean,
exactly?
Look, I mean, the privatization is a very specific kind of development, because but it follows the natural trajectory, because in the end, I mean, really what capitalist development is about capital. It's not about anything. It's really about capital. How free capital is. It's the freedom of capital that we're talking about, the mobility of capital. So in places where there was state-owned enterprises, then obviously privatizing them means that you're essentially giving it to capital, and then it will be run on capitalist principles, which means then if it is not profitable, then the operations will be reduced, or the operations will be shut down. You will lay off people or put them in some other division, you know, restructure the business basically. So that's basically what privatization is. Now, the question, of course, is that, you know, is privatization the way to go? But that's a separate matter. We all know that in the end, in a capitalist society, you have to have private business. You can't think of a capitalist society run on public sector enterprises. It doesn't work. It's basically, but the thing is that we also know that there is a complementarity between private business and the state in terms of how the economy is managed and governed. So obviously there are certain types of services or production, if you will, which are essentially what we call social goods. Then in that case, of course, you need the public enterprises to provide that. And the purpose of public enterprises is not to make money. I think this is the mistake that often people make, that somehow we have to equate it with, you know, with private businesses, that these are loss-making units, they're not making any money, therefore they should be closed. But the objective of the public enterprises is not to make money, it is to provide a service to the economy, a service to the citizens, whatever it is. So if you take big sort of, you know, certain types of operations, yeah, I mean, you do need to have some kind of public sector. Take the post office, for example. I mean, post office is a public sector. It's not that DHL or Federal Express or, you know, whatever else private services you have, that they couldn't do some of the functions. But try delivering a letter to some village somewhere called Rampur, I don't know. Okay, I mean, FedEx will not go there. So obviously there are limits to how much you can privatize. And obviously, if the post office has to do it, then maybe it will do it at a loss, because there's only maybe, you know, 500 villagers in Rampur. And, you know, they maybe get a few letters, you know, once a month. And in which case somebody has to deliver them, somebody has to be employed. So that's not a cost, I mean, that's not a profit-making operation at all. So in that sense, yes, I think the public sector is obviously important and essential, especially as it complements the private sector. But increasingly, of course, we are witnessing that private sector is doing a lot of it. But then the thing is that it's not really between this or that. It's not a black and white situation, but rather what is the best sort of mix? And this mix, of course, is a kind of a moving target. Let me put it this way, because look, I mean, we know about Air India, right? The privatization of Air India. All right. So the question, of course, is that, okay, yeah, I mean, Air India was, I mean, in many ways, yeah, it wasn't a great service either. It was a huge drain on public funds. So the question is, how do you turn it around? And yeah, if privatization means that it'll have, it'll inject more funds, it will train its workforce differently, it'll have a very different attitude, it would be more sort of, outgoing and so on and so forth, then yeah, privatization is perfectly fine. But obviously, it's also a question of, how many workers will be laid off, how will the restructuring actually take place? And honestly, I don't think Tata actually knows how to turn this thing around, right? So what I would say in the end is that privatization is, in some cases, yeah, it's necessary, but in other cases, no. I don't think we should simply privatize everything that comes in our way, because I think that would be absolutely the wrong thing to do.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor.
Okay. I have a follow-up question. Do we have like 2-3 minutes? Like you have indicated that capitalism, this kind of capitalism, they want to have their profit motive, and less state is always better. So with this kind of lens, how this kind of literature look at Scandinavian type of capitalism? I mean, politically, of course, they are socialist, the American politicians will say. But how, in the scholarly article, they are looked for this kind of capitalism?
No, I think they look, I mean, and that's the thing. So there is this literature that talks about varieties of capitalism, all right? So there's a big literature, actually, called Varieties of Capitalism, or they often refer it to as comparative capitalism kind of study, if you will. So they look at different types of capitalism in the advanced capitalist countries. So which means then, you look at, say, North America, Canada and US. Of course, Canada and US are also quite different. And then you have Europe, but within Europe, the Scandinavian countries stand out. And then, of course, you have UK, and then you have the Southern Europe or the Mediterranean countries, that what they call. So you talk about Italy, Spain, Portugal, and so on, Greece, and so on. So obviously there are differences. And of course, there are many, many institutional differences among all of these countries. So what these countries variously have tried to do, and of course, it makes it easier for those countries that have already reached a certain level of economic development, is to govern the nature of capitalism. So they are capitalist countries. The profit motive is also there. But what they are trying to do, of course, is to rein in that profit motive in a way so that the overall society benefits in some way. So in other words, so you have, let's say, high taxes. High taxes that essentially is used to provide critical services for free, which are basically health and education. These are the two things that the Scandinavian countries are basically known for, is to provide it. But their taxes are very, very high. And the people are willing to pay those high taxes because they know they're getting it also back. But also you have to remember that these are very small countries. Very, very small countries. I mean, 5 million people. Your Krishnanagar might have, I don't know how many. No, it won't have 5 million people. But anyway, the point I'm trying to say is that these are very small societies. So it's very easy to do it. And of course, they have had a certain historical sort of opportunity. Consider again, Scandinavian countries are the ones that actually sent out lots of people to the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century, which means that they actually had fewer surplus people to deal with in the first place. It made it much easier to do those kinds of things, right? So this, I think, is the thing, is that how do you, how do you sort of explain the Scandinavian? Of course, they have their particular regional sort of histories, but also this idea that they were able to essentially send out, or these immigrants that left the country, at a time when they were not very well off. Okay, so that was the other one. And then, of course, consciously also, because they are also, another thing is that they are very homogeneous societies. So when they are homogeneous, then obviously the differences in terms of, how to sort of, look to the future is also very different. They are almost they tend to agree much better than, let's say, in a very disparate, open, very diverse kind of a society where each one has their own sort of agenda. So this also makes it very, very, very easy. But they've also had certain kind of cooperative kind of arrangements very early on. So which then they, of course, applied in the case of their own societies, saying that, well, we will be prosperous, but we will share that prosperity. I mean, that is the kind of thing that, and so they created those types of institutions that would sort of lead to it, knowing fully well that, a shared prosperous society is a much more stable society. And I think, so it's with that then, of course. So yes, I mean, there, of course, you have to look at institutions undergirding the kind of social systems that they have developed. And other countries have partially done it. Some countries, so England, for example, UK, for example, it does have some, health, for example, national health system. Not so much education, but there is some subsidies going on in education. US, of course, is less so. US is the most privatized, if you will. And in fact, it is the most sort of advanced form of capitalism, if you will. But there are still some safeguards, in the sense that there are certain institutions which can still come into play to protect those who might get hurt the most. But otherwise, yeah, it's a very, very, very sort of blatantly, free market, free enterprise kind of a social system. But, obviously you have the Democratic Party, which sort of has certain sort of similarities, at least in terms of thinking, like the Europeans do, whereas the Republicans just the opposite. So even in this country, even though it is a highly privatized sort of economy, it still has certain elements of what we call social democracy, but in a very limited sort of way. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. That brings us to a closure of our session for today. I would like to propose a vote of thanks to Professor Anthony DeCosta for taking time out at such odd hours of the day.
You can see I'm very awake right now.
And we would like to propose great thankfulness for you to be part of the session.
Well, thank you very much.
And we hope that you will continue your engagement with us in the future as well.
I hope so.
And thanks to all our audience who made time to be part of the session, to the organizers at the YSI South Asia Working Group. Thank you. We would also like to say that you can join us for the informal session, which is after the formal recording has stopped. So Professor, if you have 5 minutes to spare, you can join us for an informal session, which will not be recorded.
Okay.
And coming up on 18th of November is another session by Professor Einar Overby, and that will be at 7 p.m. Indian Standard Time. Thank you.